Hey folks, welcome back to Frankenstein. We are in volume 1, chapters 6 through 7 of the 1818 edition. We're looking at, in particular today, revenge, remorse, and responsibility. These are themes that seem to be introduced in here. Also, if you hear this noise in the back, that's my chair. I was listening to some earlier YouTube videos I did, and I kept hearing that noise. You'll hear paper rustle as well. Anywho, y'all, so we are in chapters 6 through 7. And last, where we left, we had Henry Clerval and Victor Frankenstein. They are in Ingolstadt, and things are going great. Henry is able to get around town a bit. Victor has better health. He's received word that everything is well with his family. It's springtime. It's beautiful out. The trees are leafing and the flowers are blooming. And he's going to, at some point, go home. He's been gone for 6 years, which means he's 23 or 24 years of age, and he's going to leave town here shortly. I will say this, I don't know if he leaves town with a degree or not, so we call him doctor, but I'm not entirely sure that he actually got that degree. Y'all, what we saw then was the calm before the storm, but in this chapter, the novel takes a very dark turn as we hit the storm. And the storm comes, or the news of the storm, or the news that will lead to the storm, comes in a letter from his father who tells him the worst possible news, that his youngest brother, very, very young William, is dead, and William has been murdered as well. By whom, Alphonse doesn't say, which perhaps means Alphonse sent the letter before the prime suspect was known, a suspect not to be revealed until later, when Victor Frankenstein arrives home, conveniently on the very day when the trial for the suspect is going to begin. I do want to point out, this is just kind of interesting, Mary Shelley's son, William, who was born to her in January of 1816, she would have been nursing him when she wrote this section about a young William being murdered. At the news of his brother's death, Victor Frankenstein asks Henry Clerval to help him get a ride home. For some reason, Henry doesn't go. I'm not really entirely sure why Henry doesn't go. Perhaps it's for dramatic reasons, for the plot. Maybe she felt like Victor had to do this alone. That's part of his development as a character. I do think it reveals his isolationist tendencies in this novel. He definitely had very strong friendships growing up, and he has definitely moved away from them. So he's a man who can have strong friendships, but he's also a person who can very much isolate himself. So he's going to move one more time from Ingolstadt, Germany. We're going to go back to Geneva. 300, 400 miles away. It's quite a distance. So Victor hits the road and he experiences nature, which for romantics has a healing process. I like the cover of this book because I like that artwork, and I think it gets at what Victor would have experienced as well. As Victor nears Geneva, he witnesses a spectacular lightning storm in the Alps mountains. And in the process of stopping to look and getting really close to town and so on, what does he see? We finally, again, briefly, not very clearly, but he sees, and thus his audience sees, the monster. I think I want to give a shout out to Mary Shelley. She is smart about doling out the monster in small pieces. There's probably a pun there. We saw him in letter 4, right? Where we saw the crew saw him at a distance, and then we saw him in the creation scene not too shortly ago, or shortly ago, I should say. This is a smart move in a horror movie. You don't want to show the monster and all of its horrificness too soon, because your audience is going to create in their minds a far more frightening being than anything you can put on the page or on the screen. But I want you to note, we won't read all of this, but I want you to note how Victor describes the monster in this chapter. So it's all part of this process, and you can stop this at any point in time and just read these passages for yourself. But it's all part of this process. Boy, this chair is creaking. Sorry. It's all part of this process of Victor making sure that we don't totally sympathize with this creature as a human being. The creature is a creature. The creature is a monster. The creature is a wretch. The creature is a devil. And even in this chapter, interestingly enough, he calls him a vampire. So the creature is anything but human. And Victor immediately recognizes that the creature is, or at least in his take, he thinks he sees the monster. He goes, that's the guy who killed my brother. He makes that immediate connection that takes place. And we'll have to see if that's actually the case, but that's his supposition. So Victor continues on the road and he arrives back home and he goes into the house, and there's this weird picture that his father has commissioned of his deceased, of Victor's deceased mother, Alphonse's deceased wife, which shows Caroline Frankenstein bewailing the death of her father. It's a weird picture to have on your mantle, but again, I think it keys us in that there is that Caroline has an effect in the novel, and that's especially true here. We're gonna see here in just a moment. So this is a map of old time Geneva. This is Geneva in 1858, and here is modern day Geneva. We thus come to Justine Moritz, who had only recently been introduced. She has a very tragic background. The case against her comes down to someone saw her near the scene. She seemed to act a little odd. She takes to bed for days, and while she's doing that, someone looks through her clothes and the clothes that she was wearing on the day of the murder, and they find a locket. And remember, it's who's in the locket it's a locket. It's a picture or bauble. The text uses more than one term. It's a picture of Caroline, the dead mother. So again, the deceased mother keeps having some sort of presence in this novel. So really the whole court case comes down to, where did she get this locket? Elizabeth, you might remember, said that it was very expensive, and that's why she thought someone had killed William, was in order to steal this locket that she, Elizabeth, had placed around William's neck. And so they find this expensive piece of jewelry in Justine's clothing. She doesn't seem to have a good enough alibi to them, so it really all comes down to the locket. Really, Justine's situation is really sad. No one can help Justine. Her friends don't help her. Some of them don't come up and say anything because she's been accused of murder, and they don't want to be involved in that. Elizabeth can't help her. Actually, Elizabeth makes the situation worse when she gets up to testify for her, because the crowd then becomes even more sympathetic for the Frankenstein family and non-sympathetic towards Justine. Victor can help, right? Victor can do it. He could tell the truth, which goes back to this thing we talked about last time, is why doesn't Victor tell someone what happened? And Victor does talk about this. He feels like if he tells them about this monster, they're all going to think that he's crazy. Additionally, the monster is such a physical presence that he doesn't think anyone could catch it. So no one would believe me, and no one could catch it. So he feels like he can't do anything about it. At least that's what he says. The story also has this really odd angle where the priest tells her to confess to a sin that she didn't commit. And it's ultimately her confession. Well, really, the locket did her in. She wasn't going to get off this case. She wasn't going to be declared innocent. But then she declares herself guilty. And there's an interesting scene where she tries to explain why that was. I put it up here on the screen. You can stop and read that if you want. Basically, I felt like the priest pressured me to confess to a sin so that I might save a soul. But the problem is, of course, is that she hadn't committed the sin, so she's making a lie in her confession. Anyhow, I just want you to know to this, that's not Catholic teaching. That's not Catholic theology. Perhaps some anti-Catholicism has sneaked into the text here, or this also might be this Gothic thing. In Gothic fiction, you oftentimes have like the evil monk, the evil priest, the evil nun, something like that. So it could fit into that trope in fiction as well. What happens, of course, is William has been strangled by a murderer's hands, and the chapter is going to end. Although it doesn't actually detail the execution, but Justine is going to be strangled by an executioner's rope. Which brings us in quickly to some themes that are very important. One is this theme of revenge and retribution. There are chapters, these are the chapters, I should say, where these terms are really introduced. I want you to look back here to Alphonse's words to his son as he tells him to come home because his brother's been murdered. He says, "Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you and not with hatred for your enemies." So There is a cost to revenge. There's a cost to retribution. Can we really achieve it? And in this chapter, we see retribution go horribly wrong as justice is not served, as an innocent woman dies for a crime she didn't commit. Here's an example of retribution going entirely wrong. So Victor's daddy is saying, listen, don't fester these feelings. Don't let that happen. Don't brood on getting against the assassin. We'll have to see if Victor listens to that as the story develops. Justine, though, passes away. It is interesting, though, to consider Justine. As the novel unfolds, keep in mind Justine's attitude in the face of a horrific crime that's been committed against her. She's going to be executed for something she didn't do, and yet she dies at peace. So perhaps she serves as some sort of example of one way to deal with it. Although, of course, she doesn't have the opportunity really to get revenge on anyone. She could have said something nasty, I suppose, but instead she opts for a much more peaceful way out, at least as it's presented in the novel. The other thing I want us to look at quickly are these themes of remorse and responsibility. So as you look at this particular novel, in these chapters, lots of people have regrets and take responsibility in this chapter. And they feel sad and responsible for things they didn't do. So Elizabeth feels like she murdered William because of the locket. And Justine takes the responsibility for William's murder, although she didn't do it. Victor, too, feels regrets, and Victor feels responsible, but his remorse and responsibility is much more complicated. Did he kill William or Justine? No. Is he responsible for their deaths? His sense of sadness is complicated too. As he meets with Justine in her jail cell, as she awaits her execution, notice his feelings, because I think they're interesting. They're complicated feelings that he has at this particular moment. But I think you and I might be able to read these. You'll just have to stop for time. I'm not going to read this out loud. But look at these quotes here. They're at the end of the chapter, at the end of this volume. And it would almost strike me that he seems to see himself as having a victimhood, as having a punishment that these others don't have. Is that true? Yeah, in some sense, sure it is. He does have a different penalty being paid. But do you see him here saying that I've got it worse than Justine? And if you see him saying that, is that a good trait? Is that accurate? I'm going to leave that all with you, but someone might point to this as a character flaw in this man, that even at this moment when some woman is about to die for a crime that she did not commit, that he possibly could stop or possibly couldn't stop, but he doesn't even try. He seems to focus in on himself. Interesting. Think about it. Y'all have a good one. Bye.